I don't think. Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. If anyone's Hasidish in this room, it's not you. Actually, none of us are Hasidim in this room. Bunch of Litvaks. David? Yeah, but yeah, you're a big Litvak. All right. We are learning Maseches Zevachim Daf Daled. Today is a great example of the kind of dafim that we're going to see in this Masechta. A lot of psukim, a lot of very subtle, nuanced understanding. We know, of course, that there are four parts to a korban. There's the shchita, there's the kabbalah sadam, there's the holacha, and the zrika, the actual cutting, receiving of the blood, the walking of the blood from where the shchita took place to the mizbeach, and the actual zrika. But we're going to have to see some makomos on all of those. So let's get started right at the top of the page. Namir Hashem will get to the top of Hamid Aleph. This is obviously a particularly long blot, and it's very thick. And then the Shabbos blot's a little bit shorter, so Mir Hashem will get to catch up. How do we know that if we bring a korban, that it needs to be done lishma? And so says the Gemara. So this pasuk and drasha seems to tell us that the zevach shlamim has to be done for the right purposes. That's what the drasha is. Asks the Gemara, "V'dilma hainu shmaihu." Maybe the language of zevach shlamim is not like zevach, which is shlamim, but maybe the name of the korban is zevach shlamim, and therefore no raya. Says the Gemara, no midichsiv hamakir b'stam hashlamim hazorik estam hashlamim v'lo ksiv zevach. In other places, when we talk about a shlamim, we don't see that it's called zevach shlamim. The halchaksiv zevach over here, when it says zevach, that means that the word zevach is extra. Shma mina, says the Gemara, shetei zvicha l'shem shlamim. That teaches us that the shchita, the actual cutting of the throat, the actual shchita itself, has to be done l'shem. It has to be done lishma. Says the Gemara, fine. Ashkechan zvicha she'ar avodos minayin. The other three parts of a korban. We again remember the four steps. We did shchita. So now we need to speak about kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. How do we know that those have to be done lishma? If you want to just say, well, look, if it applies to zvicha, it applies to the rest. That's not true. No, because there's a time when a zevach is going to be puzzle if a korban pesach is shechted for people who have no teeth or for people who are sick. So that actually makes the korban puzzle. So therefore, you can't say that the rule of zevach can just be extended to the other three parts of the korban process. Here specifically the Kabbalah. We spoke about shchita. Now we're talking about the Kabbalah, that when one receives the dam in a vessel from the bleeding animal, it has to be done lishma. If that's the case, why don't we not have the Torah teach us about shchita being lishma? Let's have the Torah only teach us about the Kabbalah being lishma, and then we'll bridge back over to the world of shchita. Let Kabbalah be the primary marimakom. So says the Gemara, no. Mishum de'ikal mifrach mala Kabbalah shkein psula l'zar. So when it comes to to Kabbalah, that's psula l'zar. Technically speaking, a zar is allowed to do shchita, but the Kabbalah cannot be done by anyone other than a Kohen. So therefore, the shchita cannot be learned from Kabbalah. Says the Gemara, and then the word v'isha should be removed. Says the Gemara, ashkechan shchita v'Kabbalah. All right, you've given me steps 1 and 2. I understand why they need different marimakomos. We learned the marimakom of v'im zevach shlamim korbano. That taught me that the zvicha has to be done lishma. And then we learned from the pasuk of hamakriv v'stam shlamim that means the Kabbalah needs to be done lishma. Zrika minalan. How do we know that we'll get to holacha soon? How do we know that when the zrika is done that it has to be done lishma? Maybe we're able to extrapolate that just like by shchita and Kabbalah, we had marimakomos that indicated that it needs to be done lishma. Maybe we can also extend that to our world of zrika. Says the Gemara, no. Malahani, when we're talking about shchita and Kabbalah, shkein tu'unos tzafon, they can only be done. The shchita and the Kabbalah has to be done in the north. This is what the Mishnayos and Zevachim that we say every morning. Ezu makom shel Zevachim, and a lot of them are in the tzafon. But that doesn't apply to every part of the Shechita process. That only applies to the Shechita and the Kabbalah. So one of the things that's true about Shechita and Kabbalah is that they're Te'unos Safun. And the next is that V'yeshnon Bechatos HaPnimios. There are some Shechitas and Kabbalahs that are only done Pnimios, only done in the inner sanctum of the Heichal. So therefore, you cannot learn from Shechita and Kabbalah over to the world of Zrika. Then we're back to our question. From where do we know that the Zrika needs to be done Lishma? So says the Gemara, Elo Amar Kro Hazorek Es Dam Hashlamim, that if one were to do the Zrika of the Dam Hashlamim, Shetei Zrika L'Shem Shlamim. Beautiful, simple Mar Makom. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. V'lichtov Rachmana B'Zrika V'leilaf Mina. If what you're saying is that we have a very good pasuk to teach us that Zrika needs to be done Lishma, why don't we have the pasuk by Zrika and just extrapolate back to Shechita v'Kabbalah? Why do we need to have 3 Mar Makomos over here? So it says the Gemara, Mishum Dika Lemifrach, Mal Zrika Shkin Chai V'Lazar Misa. Because there's a chiddush when it comes to the world of Zrika. I didn't know this, is that if a Zar does Zrikas Hadam, he's Chayv Misa. So let's say you got this guy, he crosses over the line into the Machna Yisrael, into the Machna Kahuna. He runs in there and he says, I'm doing this. I could actually imagine that happening with our current. Azar is a non-Kohen. So he runs in there and he sticks his hand in the blood and he does Zrika, he's Chayv Misa. But that only applies by Chayv Misa. It doesn't apply by Kabbalah and it doesn't apply by Shechita. So therefore, we can't have Zrika be the bedrock of teaching us this principle that all 3 of these steps needs to be done Lishma. So therefore, we have our Mar Makomos. Ashkechan Kulu. So far, we're doing good. We have 3 out of 4 Mar Makomos. Let's review. The first thing we learned is that the Zvicha needs to be done Lishma based on the pasuk Im Zevach Shlamim Korbano. Then we learned that what was the next step? That the Kabbalah needs to be done Lishma. That was the pasuk of Hamakriv Es Dam Shlamim. Then we learned that the Zrika needs to be done Lishma, and that is based on the pasuk of Hazorek Es Dam Hashlamim. So Ashkechan Kulu. Holacha Minayin. How do we know about Holacha? That when the blood is being walked from where the Shechita took place over to the Mizbech to do the Zrika, that the Holacha itself has to be done Lishma. How do we know? Says the Gemara, maybe we can say, because we already have 3 out of the 4 steps, we have Shechita, we have Kabbalah, and we have Zrika. We know all of those are Lishma. So therefore, let's just stup in there in between. Fine, we'll include it. No, that doesn't work. Because Malakulhu, those 3 things of Shechita, Kabbalah, and Zrika, Shekein Avoda, She'i Afshar Levatla, those 3 parts of the process are 100% irreplaceable. There's no way to ever get rid of them. But Tomar Beholacha, She'afshar Levatla. But the halacha of Holacha, that can be uprooted. How? Let's say I did the Shechita right next to where I have to do Zrika Sada. Then I don't need to do Holacha. So the Gemara says, therefore, Holacha cannot be included based on the other 3. Hello Amar Kra, V'hikriv. This whole pasuk is not correct. The pasuk reads, V'hikriv hakohen es hakol v'hiktir hamizbecha olahu ishe reach nichoach laHashem. So that's what the pasuk says. V'hikriv v'chulei v'amar mar holeches evarim lekevesh. Walking over these animal parts to the kevesh, to the ramp, that's important. V'tanya v'hikrivo ze kabbalah sadam. Ve'apik rachmana b'lashon halacha. Why does the pasuk say v'hikriv if it means holacha? L'meimra de holacha lo tifka miklal kabbalah. That we should not say that holacha is any different than kabbalah. Even though you're right, fundamentally, we could avoid it in theory. But really, when we talk about Shechita, we always talk about it in that it has 4 parts. And we're not going to exclude halacha, even though theoretically we could have done so. So says the Gemara, Ashkechan Shinui Kodesh. Got it. I understand when it comes to Shinui Kodesh, to making changes with korbanos that are hektish, korbanos that are part of the Beis HaMikdash. I understand, says the Gemara. I understand that there we have the 4 halachos of Shechita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika, that all of them are Lishma. As it turns out, all 4 steps are learned out from 4 different psukim. Asks the Gemara though, Shinui Bailim Inala. How do we know that if there's Shinui Bailim, that it applies to all 4 steps? We've only spoken about an animal that's being brought as a korban. What about an animal that's being brought for the wrong Bailim? That's a whole nother ballgame. So let's say Reb Daniel over here is supposed to bring a chatas and he ends up bringing it for me. Or I have a chatas, I end up bringing it for him. Or he takes my chatas, whatever the details are. How do we know that that's not allowed? So Amar of Pinchas, we're halfway down on Dalad Aleph. Amar of Pinchas, Breder of Ami, Amar Kra. B'sar Zevach Todah Shlamav, the meat of the Zevach, which is Todah Shlamav, Shetei Zvicha L'Shem Todah, that it has to be done for the sake of a Todah. So that sounds like what we learned earlier, that it's has to be Lishma. But we don't need that. We already learned that above. That's what we spent the whole first half of the page doing, learning that Shinui Kodesh is problematic. So if our drasha over here seems to be talking about Zvicha L'Shem Todah, but we don't need it over there because we already learned it, Im Eno Inyan L'Shinui Kodesh, I don't need that drasha to teach me about Shinui Kodesh. That was the first whole half of the Amud, where with 4 separate psukim, we learned that Shchita, Kabbalah, Halach, and Zrika are going to be required to be Lishma. So therefore, because it's extra, because this drasha over here that of Bisar Zevach Todah Shlomo seems to be talking about Lishma, therefore, Imenu Inyan L'Shinui Kodesh to Nafkalan Mihasim, we learned it from the top half of the page. Snehu Inyan L'Shinui Bailim. Maybe we can just bring it over. It's an extra drasha. This goes into the complex questions of methodologies. Why would a Kodesh Baruch Hu make a pasuk that's extra in one space to be extrapolated only for another? Because what it sounds like is this pasuk is talking about Kodesh. It sounds like it's talking about Korban Shalol Lishma. But we already spent the whole first half of the page discussing that. So what does this mean? But nevertheless, that's what the Gemara says, and this is our Mar Makom, that the shchita that is done by Shinui Bailim is not allowed. That's not ideal. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second, that pasuk is used already. The pasuk of Ubsar Zevach Todah Shlamav is used already. What does the Brisa say? This is a Brisa that's just in a few days' time, Emir Tashem on Sunday or Monday. So says the Gemara, of the same pasuk. Abachanin Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer Ba Lelamed Toda Sheshachta L'Shem Shlamim Kshera Shlamim Sheshachta L'Shem Toda Psula. It's coming to teach me another din, that if I bring a Toda as a Shlamim, it's already a Shlamim. It's just part of the broader category, but not a Toda. That works. But if I bring a Shlamim Sheshachta L'Shem Toda, that is Psula. So therefore, we have a problem because the pasuk's not available. And what do we see from this line of Rabbi Eliezer, of Abachan in the name of Rabbi Eliezer? Ma hefresh bein zeh. What's the difference between bringing a Toda as a Shlamim or a Shlamim as a Toda? Well, a Toda is Kriya Shlamim. A Toda is already in the Shlamim category. Bein Shlamim Kriya Toda. But not every Shlamim is called a Toda. So it says the Gemara, good question. You seem to be correct that Ubsar Zevach Toda Shlamav is already being used to teach me that I can't use a Toda, I can't use a Shlamim as a Toda, but I can use a Toda as a Shlamim. So therefore, where's our Mari Makom to teach us that when it comes to Shinui Bailim, that it's usher to do Shchita, Ba'anan mi Zevach ka'amrinan. The word Zevach was extra. Discussions here in the Rishonim, how we know the word Zevach was extra. We're going to take it at face value that it is, and therefore, while the general drasha of Ubisar Zevach Toda Shlamav is needed to teach me that I cannot bring that I can bring a Toda as a Shlamim, but I cannot bring a Shlamim as a Toda, even though that's true, but the word Zevach is actually extra, which teaches me the din that I was looking for all along, that if a Korban was brought by Shinui Bailim, the Korban's not kosher. Says the Gemara 3/4 of the way down, 15 lines from the bottom. Hold on 1 second. Chatas ve'asham minayin. I only know about a Korban Toda. That these same halachos of Shinui Bailim would apply by a chatas and an asham. Because remember, our mar makom of Shinui Bailim was Toda. So says the Gemara, Talmud Lomar, Zevach. Because we have the word Zevach, which teaches this to us. Says the Gemara, Imkein nichtov kro b'sar Toda Shlamav Zevach. My Zevach Toda Shlamav, that's what should be the extra word, Shmami Notarte. Because the word Zevach was placed in a different place, not even that it's an extra word, just from its placement, the syntax, to go over here, to go over there. Simply because of its locale, we are able to make another drasha. And we therefore learn 2 things from the word drasha. The first thing we learn is that Shinui Bailim is not allowed. You're not allowed to change the Bailim of a Korban. And the second thing we learn is that not only does it apply by Toda, which was the core pasuk that we used to learn this, but it also applies by Chatas and Shlamim. So says the Gemara, Ashkechan Zvicha, within the world which we're now discussing, which is Shinui Bailim, you've answered up the question for me about Zevachim, that if the actual Shchita itself was done by someone for the wrong person, so then that doesn't work. Sha'ar avodos minalan. How do we know about the other three? We learned about Zvicha. How do we know by Shinui Bailim that Kabbalah, Holach, and Zrika are going to be Asr? I just want to pause and review just so that we're clear. The top half of the Amud was talking about Shinui Kodesh, was just talking about Korbanos Stam, Korbanos that are being brought for halachic purposes. There we proved with four separate psukim that Shchita, Kabbalah, Halach, and Zrika all need to be Lishma. The second half of this page is talking about Shinui Bailim, and we've already proven Zvicha. So now we're going to move on to the Sha'ar Avodos. So ask the Gemara 10 lines from the bottom. Sha'ar Avodos Minalan. How do we know that when it comes to Shinui Bailim, that the other three Avodos are going to be Aser? If you want to say that we can learn from Zvicha, we already said earlier in the page by our discussions of Shinui Kodesh that that's not allowed. Zvicha is unique. It's unique in that if it were to be done for people who were sick or couldn't chew, so then the korban is not kosher. So Zvicha is more chamor than the other three. So therefore, says the Gemara, Nemra Zvicha b'Shinui Kodesh, Nemra Zvicha b'Shinui Bailim. We have a Gzeira Shava. We have the word Zvicha from the top of the page discussing Shinui Kodesh. And we have Zvicha over here by Shinui Bailim. Ma Zvicha ha'amura b'Shinui Kodesh lo chalakta bein Zvicha l'sha'ar avodos. Just like, at least broadly speaking, we concluded that Shinui Kodesh is usher to do Shalol Lishma. So too over here, Av Zvicha ha'amura b'Shinui Bailim lo chalak bein Zvicha l'sha'ar avodos. Very good. So now we have our Gzeira Shava. So let's, in this case of Shinui Bailim, we learn Zvicha from the word Zevach, that we know that that has to be done only for the right person and cannot be done for the wrong person. And then the rest of the Avodos are learned from the Gzeira Shava of Zvicha. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second, your Gzeira Shava is not good. Why is your Gzeira Shava not good? 3 lines from the bottom, on Daled Amud Aleph. There are uniquenesses of Shinui Kodesh by the halachos of regular korbanos. Shekain psula b'gufa, that there could be a fundamental psul in the guf, which isn't necessarily applicable to Bailim, v'yeshno ba'arba avodos, and the halachos apply broadly for all avodos. But by Shinui Bailim, only the Zrika ruins the korban. That's not evident from the Gemara, but that is what's going on. V'yeshno le'achar misa. By Shinui Kodesh, it says Yeshno la'achar misa. Rashi explains 2 lines from the bottom. Yeshno la'achar misa. Hamafresh korbano umes v'hayoresh makrivo shayach bo Shinui Kodesh. Avalo Shinui bam shar mesu bailam. Is that when somebody dies, the korban is still brought as though it was from the original person. There's no concern of Shinui bailam. And also v'yeshno b'tzivur kibiyachid. Also, it's the case that v'yeshno b'tzivur, that when we talk about Shinui Kodesh, that applies both by the tzibur and by a yachid. And Rashi fills in the gaps. Aval Shinui Bailim lo shaykh b'korban tzibur sheharei hakol bailim. But when it comes to Shinui Bailim, the halacha is not that way. The halacha is that only applies to a korban yachid. There is no Shinui Bailim by a korban tzibur. What does that mean? Shinui Bailim by korban tzibur. The tzibur is not Bailim. So the Gemara now wants to say that we have a problem with our Gzeira Shava. And the problem is that if we have a problem with our Gzeira Shava, then we also don't know if the Sha'ar Avodos of Kabbalah, Holach, and Zrika would be problematic as it relates to Shinui Bailim. So says the Gemara on the top of Daled Amud Beis, V'yafal gav de tarte lav dafka, tarte miha dafka. Of the 4 reasons why this Gzeira Shava of Zvicha might not work, 2 of them are valid and 2 of them are not. What is it about Shinui Bailim where we said that there's no psul beguf? That's based on machshava ba'alma. Shinui Kodesh nami machshava ba'almahu. Why would we say that it passes Shinui Kodesh? It's just a machshava. Alakevan da'achshava pasla hachanami kevan da'achshava pasla. Says the Gemara. But since by Shinui Kodesh we have a psul in machshava is pigol, whatever the case may be, so too by Shinui Bailim. So therefore, that's no longer a good reason to ruin the Gzeira Shava. Well, the Rab Pinchas brei Rab Mari de Amar Yeshinui Bailam Lachar Misa, and Rab Pinchas was of the opinion that there is Shinui Bailam Lachar Misa. This is a very unique din. The man died, but we still have a restriction of bringing the korban. He's dead. So that's a machlokas in the Tanaim over here. So maybe that's not not a good thing. But tarte mia ikal mifrach. But the other two distinctions are still very good questions. So because of that, remember we learned the sha'ar avodos from agzer shavav zvicha zvicha. Now what we're going to do is say that doesn't work, and now we'll learn mar makomos for these different items. Ella says the Gemara, Amar Ravashi, Amar Krav, Nir Tzalo Lechaper Love. This is talking about zrika below al chavero, and therefore what we see is that there's a psul by shinui bailim of doing zrika in the wrong way. The pasuk of a nir tzalo is used to teach me this halacha that zrika by shinui bailim needs to be done properly for the right person. No, that pasuk of a nir tzalo was used for something else. It's used for another brisa of a nir tzalo lechaper olav. And what does the brisa say about that? Remeir Omer, Eshe alav chayav ba'achrayuso. If a person says Hare alai, he brings a korban upon himself, then he's chayav ba'achrayuso. So if the animal gets lost, he has to bring the animal. He has to bring a new one. Ve'she'eno alav, if he doesn't use the language of alav, he doesn't bring it upon himself. Eno chayav ba'achrayuso. Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi mahi taima. So says the Gemara, Kevan de Amar alai, since he said Hare alai, kamad de ton le'akatve, that means as if he's bringing it on his own shoulders. Ravashi, what does he say? Different reason. That the reason why Reb Shimon holds what he does in this Mishnah is v'nir tzalo lechaper kama. Oh, so now the pasuk that we have, which you wanted to use to teach us that zrikas hadam by shinui bailam has to be done for the right person, here the brisa seems to say that Reb Shimon's utilizing that pasuk to teach us his din. So that's what the Gemara says. That's why we're okay. Is that we reject that. And we are good to go, and we have our first Mari Makom, which is Zrika is learned from Vinir Tzalo. We still have the rest of the pasuk to learn from. Ashkechan Zvicha Uzrika, Kabbalah Minalan. When we're talking about Shinui Bailam, which is our current sugya, how do we know, says the Gemara, that Kabbalah has to be done L'Shem Bailim, and there's no Shinui Bailim? Maybe we could learn Kabbalah from Zvicha Uzrika. Nope. If a person were to do Zvicha and Zrika, like Shchute Chutz is what we refer to, did outside of the Makom Azara, so that's not good, you'd be Chayiv. So therefore, those two things are in that category. Zvicha and Zrika are Chayiv and Aleh Bachutz, but Halacha and Kabbalah are not. So therefore, says the Gemara, Amar Rav Ashi, Asim El Nazir. We learn it from one of the three korbanos that a Nazir brings after his Nazirus ends. What do we see from over here? That we learn from the Shlamim that the Kabbalah has to be done l'shem shamayim. How do we see that from here? Because this pasuk seems to be talking about lishma. Look at the language. L'shem shlamim. But we already learned about shinui kodesh. We don't need another pasuk to teach us about lishma. Therefore, v'meinu inyan l'shinui kodesh. If it's not a pasuk that applies to shinui kodesh, because pasuk we learned about it on the top of Daled Amud Aleph, the nafkale mehasam, we learned it already. Snei inyan l'shinui bailim. So the Gemara says, therefore, we're going to use it to teach us this dins that's specifically about Kabbalah within Shinui Bailim. Hamarle Ravacha bar Abba leRava Ema. Perhaps we should say that the word Ya'aseh in the pasuk reads Ve'es ha'ayal Ya'aseh Zevach Shlamim. Ya'aseh is a klal and Zevach is a prat, and klalu prat in b'chlal elamashe b'prat. Maybe we should say it's a klalu prat. And what would that mean? Zvicha in midiacharin alo. That the pasuk's really only talking about zvicha, and you can't learn anything from there. So if it's a klalu prat, it's a super limiting thing, which is that it's only talking about zvicha. Says the Gemara, v'iksiv, had the pasuk iksiv, if the pasuk would have been written the way you were talking, yaseh shlamim zevach kedeka amris. If the flow of the pasuk was first the word yaseh and then shlamim and then zevach, I'd agree with you. But hashta dechsiv Yaseh Zevach Shlamim. Now that the word Zevach separates Yaseh and Shlamim, Havale Klal She'eno Male. It's not a good klal as it relates to Klal Uprat. But therefore, the word klal falls apart. So the Gemara says, V'chol klal she'eno male ein danin oso b'chlal uprat. If you have a klal that's insufficient, that's low quality, such as this one, it's not male because it's not next to the right word. It's not Ya'aseh Zevach, it's Ya'aseh Shlamim Zevach. So it's not Ya'aseh shlamim, it's ya'aseh zevach shlamim. So therefore, ein danan oso b'klal ufra. Ravina argues. Ravina Amar la'olam danan, even if the klal is a klal that's not malay, you're still allowed to do so. That not only that, but v'la Hashem chazaru klal. So now we converted our klalu prat, which was super limited, to a klalu pratu klal, where we learn general broad principles and apply to many things. Amar le Ravachim difti le Ravina. V'halo dami klala kama le klala basra. If you want to say that it's a klalu pratu klal, like Ravina wanted to suggest, there's a problem. The first time it says klala, the first klal that it presents, which is ya'aseh, is different than the second klal, which is v'la Hashem. Klala kama, the first klal teaches us mar be'asiyos v'sulo. It includes the extra 3 steps of Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika. But klala basra, kol Hashem. But when we talk about the word la Hashem at the end, which is the second klal, v'afilu shvicha shirayim v'aktara semurim, that's not even talking about the shechita process alone. That's much broader. It's talking about all the extra blood that's going to be thrown on the mizbeach, and aktara semurim is throwing in all the extra body parts. So that can't be the case either. So says the Gemara, it's not a problem. You're trying to find problems with the klal, the pradu klal. Says the Gemara, 2/3 of the way down. Hatana de Rabbi Shmuel beklali uprate darish ki agavna. No problem at all. And therefore, klalu pradu klal yatadana elakena prat. The pasuk that we were looking at of Ya'aseh ve'eshayal Ya'aseh zevach shlamim. So says the Gemara, yatadana elakena prat mahaprat mefurash avoda uvainan lishman. Just like the prat is mefurash avoda uva'inan lishma, that it is talking about the steps of the korbanos and they have to be lishma. Av kol avoda uva'inan lishma. All steps of all korbanos have to be done the right way. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Ima haprat mefurash avoda v'chayven aleh b'chutz. Av kol avoda shechayven aleh b'chutz, which only applies to shchita zrika in Kabbalah v'halacha lo. Says the Gemara, maybe we shouldn't learn that way because there's something unique about things that are chayav and aleh b'chutz, which only applies to shchita and zrika. Inami, another problem might be, says the Gemara, that mahaprat mafurash davar haton safon v'yeshna bechatos pnimius. Maybe we could say, like we said earlier, that it could be that when it comes to certain things, they apply only to the north. They have to be done on the north side of the mizbeach, and they're only done inside the heichal. Av kol haton safon v'yeshna bechatos pnimius, which is shchita v'kabbalah and zrikalo. Perhaps the halachos wouldn't be so clear that it applies to all of it. So the klal upradu klal has a lot of challenges to it. Says the Gemara, ikala meimar hachi, ve'ikala meimar hachi. Both of those are possibilities, and shkulen hein v'yavo shnein, and they're both true. Says the Gemara, lishnachrina v'chada teku b'milsa. Each one of them could be answered up on their own. Iba yisema zrika midirav ashi nafka. Or you can say that we're talking about zrika within the shita of Rav Ashi. So then the Gemara says, Ashkechan Ayal Nazir. So now we understand the Ayal Nazir, and that also helps us with our case of Shinui Bailim. But the problem is, Sha'ar Shlamim Minayin. How do we know that this actually applies to all other Shlamim, and not just Nazir? Because Nazir is a very narrow example of a Shlamim. You can't learn from there. There, we have damim acherim. The nazir brings other korbanos. So perhaps the only reason that the nazir is getting his tshuva process, he's getting kapara, is because he brought 3 korbanos. So just learning from el nazir alone is not enough. Maybe that's not enough to bring about a full kapara. Imkain, says the Gemara, nichtov shalamav. If that were to have been true, then by the nazir should have said shlamav, his korban. My shlamim l'rabos kol shlamim. From the fact that the word is plural in the pasuk, then we see that it applies to all of them. Okay, Ashkechan Shlamim, you found Shlamim. What about the rest of Kachim? Sha'ar kol Kachim minayin, minalan. How do we know that Chatas, Asham, all the different kinds of korbanos? Now you've only taught me about a small scope, which is Shlamim. You can't learn everything from Shlamim. Why not? When it comes to the Shlamim, it has these very specific and isolated dinim. It needs smicha to be pressed down. Nesachin, there are special libations, and you have to do these physical movements with the chazah and with the shok. So therefore, you can't learn Shlamim from everything. That's why the Gemara says, don't worry, we have a beautiful pasuk, a pasuk from Vayikra Perek Zayin. Now, Lamar Kra Zosa Torah. Le'ola, le'mincha, ve'lechatas, ve'le'asham, ve'le'amimlumim, ve'lezevach hashlamim. Ha'keshan ha'kasu, ve'leshlamim. Ma l'shlamim, bein shinui kodesh, bein shinui ba'al, bein l'shma. Just like when it comes to shlamim, it applies to shinui kodesh and shinui bailim that you need to do lishma because of the pasuk, and the pasuk is what equates shlamim to the others. Af kol bein shinui kodesh bein shinui bailim ba'inon lishma. And that really kind of wraps up this piece of the sugi over here of Shinui Bailim. I know it's very nuanced in the psukim, but nevertheless, the Gemara that we've learned so far on Daled Amud Aleph on the top half, we learned about Shinui Kodesh and brought a Marimakom for each of the four steps of Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, Zrika, that each of them need to be done lishma. Then we shifted our focus to Shinui Bailim, about doing things for the sake of other people with korbanos. There too we brought psukim, a sufficient number of psukim to teach us that it applies to also Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, and Zrika. Then the Gemara just asks one more question, which is, Ema hecha deshachit lahu shelo lishmo lifselo. So wait one second, I don't understand our Mishnah. If you'll recall, our Mishnah when we opened said that the shechita was kshera, it's just that you have to replace the korban. So let's say that I do shinui bailim or I do shinui kodesh, I do it the wrong way. So the Mishnah had said, the korban's not puzzle, it just doesn't count for your chatas. Why did the Mishnah say that? Why not say it's puzzle? So says the Gemara, we can't say it's puzzle, Amar Kra, because the pasuk says in Dvarim Chav Gimel, Motza sosecha tishmor v'asisa ka'asher nadarta v'chulei, and then the rest of the pasuk refers to it as a nedava, as we saw the other day. Hi nedava, nederhu. How come the pasuk refers to this person's neder as a nedava? Ella, im kemasha nedarta asisa yehe neder. If you're following it, the halachos correctly, you bring the korban at the right time, it'll be a neder. And if not, then it'll be a nedava. Meaning, if you shecht it, but you do so b'shinui kodesh or shinui bailim, okay, it'll still be kosher. It just doesn't count as your chiyuv. And v'itzrich motzei svasecha v'itzrich zos Torah, and I need both psukim to teach this to me. If I only had the first pasuk of motza, that's the example of neder and nedava. Havamina, turning to the top of Hamid Aleph. Says the Gemara, lo yoda b'may. We wouldn't know exactly what we were talking about. Rashi says, lo yodana b'may ka'amar rachmana motzas vasecha tishmor. I wouldn't know what he's talking about because the halok sid behedja b'haikra avodos lishman. Because that pasuk doesn't talk about avodas lishman, doing things for the right reason. Therefore, back in the Gemara, in the top line of Ham and Aleph, Katsav Rachmana Zosa Torah. That's why we had a second pasuk to teach us what we were talking about. That we were talking about the din of lishma. But if I only had the latter pasuk, Havamina Lifsilu, I might have thought that the korban should have taka been pasul in our Mishnah, but that's not true. Therefore, Kasav Rachmana Motzas Vasecha to teach us this balancing act. That when it comes to lishma, you're right that lishma is important for your chiyuv, and you're right that you're not yotzei achatas, but at least the animal is kosher. So we'll stop right here at Rami Reish Lakish and Amir Hashem on Shabbos. We'll pick up here. Wishing you all a beautiful night.